Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This, on my iPad, is Auria. A-U-R-I-A, Auria. And if you've not heard of it, this is how you do a professional style mix entirely on an iPad. Let's check it out. Okay, so this is the kind of thing you would expect to see in something like Pro Tools or Logic. This is the edit window, and then of course there's the mix window. It's set up, unlike GarageBand, which is trying to kind of guide you through a bit by bit in a kind of section-based way. This is much more how a professional would see it. It's the entire song in one go. And you can zoom in and out, and time-wise, it doesn't particularly care which bit you want to look at, which is great because I might just want to look at different bits at different times. Thanks to Second City Coffee for the Cottonopolis blend, by the way. Check them out. This is a fantastic brew. And here we go. Let's cut the camera to the screen so you can see. Oh, here we go, there we go. So you'll be able to see now what I'm doing on the screen. So this song was recorded in the studio, in Hot Pole Studios. This wasn't recorded originally in Auria, this was recorded in Reaper through the studio setup and exported as stems so that I can show you how we mix in Auria. So the first thing to note about Auria is that unlike something like GarageBand, you can just import as many audio tracks as you like, completely uncompressed, and it'll just take them, stick them on channels, and you're off, which is fantastic. So I exported separate drums, stereo overheads, 4 rhythm guitars, 2 solo guitars for this particular track, a vocal, a backing vocal, 4 backing vocals and 3 gang vocals. So that's 24 tracks. Oh, that's a fair few, even for a kind of a stem mix down. So doing it this way, I've already picked the takes. So that's done. So this is purely a mix job. So let's see how it sounds. Okay, as you can see, this is all just blocks. Because it's a stem mix, there's no need to go around chopping everything. Apart from there was a little bit of noise at the start of this guitar solo. So all I did is I zoomed right in with pinch fingers, which is nice and quick. Held my finger down on this little button at the bottom for the arrow, and then just dragged it to where I needed it, to within a pixel's accuracy, which is pretty cool. And that, for this particular song, was all I needed. If I want to go, because I actually cut and cleaned everything up before I imported it, I could split this with the split button and then do the same, cut it, and then move on the track, and then put the cursor there and keep going and split it over and over and over. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing it that way. Maybe for your own visual peace of mind, but in this particular case, there's not really any need for me to go through, because with being truly silent, rather than kind of silent as in, you know, when no one's playing but there's all scratching and this is properly zeroed where it should be. So I will start looking at this mix the way that I would look at any mix, and that is to start on the mix window with the drums. So the drums I have named appropriately. So it's kick, snare, top and bottom. It had 2 toms on the kit, but on this track it turns out he didn't use tom 2 at all, which is why the little M for mute is lit up. Because why would you let that bleed through when it's not being used at all? Hi-hat, overheads and room. So that's 8 channels, and that's going through to a submix, drums. So if I just hit S for solo here, let's listen to what we got. Okay. Okay, so there's quite a lot of reverb on that snare, but it was a very dry sounding thing to begin with. What's nice in the top right corner, you'll see there's a CPU meter bouncing away, and that gives us a good indication of how much more we can load on, because you can put inbuilt effects on every channel if you so desire in this, and the only limit is how much processing power you have. Now, if you do run out of processing power and you're in an effects on a channel, there is a tiny little snowflake button. All I have to do is press that. It will freeze the track. On an iPad mini or an older iPad 2, this might be enough time for you to go and make a cup of coffee. But here we are done. Now that will set everything in stone. And much like Cubase's old freeze technique, which I've been using for years now. Well, I used to until computers were powerful enough that I didn't need to freeze things. Because if you want to go in and just gently tweak an EQ, you have to unfreeze it, change it, refreeze it. Ugh, awful. But in terms of getting through a mix on something that's not quite powerful enough, that works absolutely fine. So, unfrozen. Let's see. So, one thing that's slightly unintuitive about this is that the EQ section, compressor section, and gate section that are on every channel don't work until you specifically turn them on at the bottom. See, I'm turning the expander on and off. If you change any of the settings on this, doesn't make any difference at all until it's turned on. And its specific section is turned on as well, which is a little annoying at first, but once you get used to it, you just kind of put it into your habits. I suppose it saves on processing power, and just having to manually enable things means that they can just cut it out of the processing chain any other time. So what have I done to the kick? This kick, let's just solo the kick. So let's just unmute everything and, oh. So that was, okay, so the kick. Is not nearly as loud as you would have thought, which is interesting. There's a lot of kick coming through on the overhead and room mic, so let's start the way that I would usually start a drum mix, which is the overheads and room. So the overheads were in stereo. I recorded with the SE5s in a stereo pair. Fantastic mics, and I'm going to do a review video on them pretty soon, if it's not already out. And the overheads have some EQ and looks like fairly heavy compression. So, the overheads, as they came in, sounded like this, which is pretty good. But mixing for me, even when it's pretty good, is making sure things fit in context. So, this EQ, what's it doing? So, there's a high pass, so anything about below 200 hertz, and above about 12K, 15K is shelved off, because the SE5 mics are so transparent that the ultra lows and the ultra highs come through. And in a classic rock mix, they're not really desirable, because if you're thinking about classic rock was usually recorded onto tape. And tape famously makes things warmer, and the main reason it makes things warmer is it can't cope with high frequencies, ultra high frequencies and ultra low frequencies, because you're trying to shift magnetic little pieces of rust essentially on a piece of plastic, and there's only so far and so much detail you can move them, which in turn makes tape quote unquote good for what the human ear likes. So I make my overheads react like they would in tape. So what have I done? Apart from cutting, it's all cutting by the looks of things. So around 200 hertz on this this left dial here. I've cut around 200 hertz with a big lump because there was a big thump on the snare drum that was overriding everything. And around 5K I've taken out just a couple of dB there as well. Probably because the hi-hat when it was open on this song, which is a lot of the song, was really piercing through, so ouch. Now the compressor, that's turned on. That's at 3-1 and is quite heavy. So that'll be to control those snare hits. The release and attack are fairly standard, so relatively fast, maybe 15 millisecond attack, 300 millisecond release, so that there's no pumping, but there's no grinding on it either. So they together, so if I turn off this high EQ and turn it back on, you might notice that the hi-hats get a little bit less, so off, and that hi-hat pierces. On and the hi-hat's there still, but it's just a little bit soft. So that's the overheads on their own. Now the room, this is where it gets interesting because the room, if I turn everything off, was in mono. The room was the SE Gemini on the drums, facing away into a corner to get a bigger kind of roomy tone. But the Gemini, as opposed to kind of usually use maybe something like ribbon mics for room mics to stop from adding too much high end, this mic is wonderfully bright, has no transformers in, and for something like vocals, it can make for a mix-ready kind of sound, which is fantastic. But for room mics, it can be a bit like, too much. So the EQ first shelves off everything above about 5K, 6K, because we just don't need to add any more of that. We've already got plenty of that going on the overheads. What we want is that kind of meaty mid that the room mics can bring. So the other thing is around 300 hertz, we've got quite a big scoop going because again, it was making the kick and the snare muddy, but in that kind of frequency range. And you hear that kind of boxy sounding kick drum here. So let's just keep it playing and you'll hear. So as soon as I turn on and jump in, hear that boxiness on the snare and kick have just gone. That's what we're after. So let's have a look at the compression on this now. The compression's pretty heavy again, but it's on limiter mode, so it really squishes and crushes the thing with a very fast release so that it just holds the mic in place. And you hear how it really squishes and crushes everything. And this is really tightly controlled and on its own would be completely unusable. But as a secondary mic, so this is the overheads, which are a bit polite, a bit nice. So the room really turns it into a fire-breathing monster. Now, if we go back to the full mix on the room, there's insert 1 and insert 2 because you can have up to 4 inserts inbuilt in this, which is fantastic. The inbuilt ones are absolutely great for what I need. You can buy more in the plugin store and you can use inter-app audio as well, which seems to be a bit buggy right now, but hopefully as that gets improved in the future, I'll be able to show you more of that. So in the meantime, the ones that I've used as inserts, it's quite odd, but I've added a convolution reverb on, let's have a look, convolution reverb on the room. It's about 50% of the mix. And the nice room, so I've put the room in another room. It's a bit like Pimp My Ride. I heard you like room, so I put your room in another room. So that makes things go from being quite focused to being bigger sounding. Because my drum room, my main live room, is not absolutely huge. And I use it for more than just drum recording, so I need it to be quite controlled and dry, really. So to make it sound bigger, I can always add more room, but it's very difficult to take away later. And then the last thing that I've done is this stereo delay. Now what have I done here? I've used this delay not as a kind of ping pong kind of delay, but as a creative tool, because the room mic being in mono really kind of gets in your face and interferes with the kick and the snare. So what I've done in this case is I've left one side, I think the left side, completely dry, and I've made the right side completely not EQ'd, just delayed by 15 milliseconds, which is enough with no feedback, so it's ba-bang, but quicker than that it just moves everything out of the center of the stereo image without affecting it in any other way. I mean, it makes for a slightly less coherent sound in mono, but because this is only a supporting mic anyway, the kick and the snare and all that punchiness come through on a mono device. And this was helping on a stereo field, and if that disappears and gets cancelled out for mixing mono, that's all right to me. So if I bypass that, so bypassed its mono, and you can hear that room's right in your face. And then unbypassed, suddenly you feel it. It feels like some sort of panorama. Off, on. And that, combined with the nice polite overheads, and then a little bit of the hi-hat on the left-hand side, and then the kick and snare, suddenly feels like a 1970s quite thumpy AC/DC rock kit, which mostly, to be quite honest, comes from the drum kit that the drummer was using, which was very dead sounding purposefully to get that big, fat kind of tone that you wouldn't want on something like that modern progressive metal or something. You would want no sustain, no ring, just so we worked with that. So this is how I would now work with my drum kit, is I would do the overheads, rooms, and throw in the hi-hat, which doesn't even have any EQ on, it's just lower in the mix and off to the side, just to make a little more definition. So let's play this back, just make sure, yeah, so we're at the start of the track. So let's bring in the kick now. Now it would seem that there's enough low-end kind of meat on this. Let's just... Yeah, so the kick, what have I done here? So there's no need for a gate because the mic was firmly inside the kick drum, so it doesn't need any kind of artificial gating. It's isolated enough for this. So what have we done? I appear to have added an absolute shed load of low end, which is... So the way that this shelf works, it's a gentle rise around the peak. So where it says 50 hertz, I guess, that is kind of below what I would need. But because that's a gentle lift that doesn't really affect those muddy frequencies too much, that's where that's gone in. There seems to be quite a bit of 10K-ish high shelf, which just lifts the clarity of the kick out a little bit. If I turn off the overheads and room, this will sound pretty horrible, and it will make no sense. It will sound like clicky, quacky nonsense. But the meat of the tone is being carried by that heavily compressed room mic. Now keep in mind we've not turned the snare on yet, so that sounds a bit odd. What else have we got? So we've got a good bit of kind of 2.5K being added as a wide bump, just to add some punch to this kick. and a bit of a dip around 300 Hz to take away some of the boxiness. So let's throw in the tom, which has apparently got the gate on. There we go. But this gate is not very gatey. It's not turning the signal off. You listen to that. That's supposed to be a gate. Except that I can hear the original track when the gate's closed. It doesn't make much sense to me, but it's the closest I can get to a gate in here, despite the fact that it's on that setting. Okay, so the snare channels. These sound pretty awful, but in context, they suddenly sound a lot better. Okay, because if we look at the snare, what have I done? So this has got a gate on it just to clear up the extra hi-hat spill. And it's got a low boost, a high boost, some boxiness cut again, and some 2.5K presence, almost exactly the same as the kick. To kind of modernise the mix, I guess. And there is a compressor here with a very slow attack of 50 milliseconds, and that's just to make the snare go from being quite a wet kind of thing to having quite a bit of crack to it. And the snare bottom has just got some high end added, and the same kind of compressor on as the snare top, except this only really kicks in when the snare's really cracked. So far, I hope you can see that Auria is pretty powerful. I mean, compared to GarageBand, where you've got like 4 presets for your reverb, and the EQs have got a bass slider and a treble slider, and this has got, well, if you know what you're doing with a panel like this, this is so much more powerful than just a bass and a treble slider. Which means I can do full mixes on the fly. I mean, arguably I'd like to sit down at a desk with full monitors rather than working on headphones on a train, or wherever I would use this. But if I didn't have the budget for a full studio, I can still learn my craft on this. If I've got a deadline and I need a track roughly mixing for, say, a background for a piece that's not absolutely, like, doesn't need to be mastered to CD release quality but still needs to not sound naff, I can work with this on, say, if I'm on a train to London, 2 hours, I can either sit there and stare out the window, or I can get some work done, and this allows me to do some fairly serious work. Even if I only use this to do a mix, to go, right, when I get back to the studio, this is exactly what I'm going to do, but with hardware and with the big time plugins, this is still pretty good for that kind of thing. Let's just lastly cover the drums overall, because I'm sending them to a subgroup, and then this has inbuilt another overall EQ, which is quite specific, a compressor that's a lot like the SSL bus compressor, the G series bus compressor, and then there's a limiter as well. And the limiter I've used here very gently in an opto kind of style, so it's kind of like running it through an LA2A as a drum bus, which is pretty useful, because that goes from sounding like this, which is okay, to this, to this, to this. And it's not done very much per part, but on the dynamic parts of the track and on the quiet parts of the track, this provides a certain amount of glue and just holds the track together. I mean, if I want to hit this compressor a little harder to get the breathing going, just bring up the threshold on that. So it's taking a few dB off now. Turn the attack on the compressor up to maybe 30 milliseconds. just so the thump of the snare punches through more. And then just make up the gain a little. So that's gone from this, which is fine, to this where the hi-hats breathe through a little, the snare punches and makes way for itself. It's a very clever kind of thing to do. Is a little bit of light bus compression on drums can just make the bigger drums make way for themselves, and then the hats and the overhead cymbals kind of make space for themselves by the release time pushing them up whenever there's space for them. Makes the kit sound massive without really irritating people's ears and making the mix too aggressive. It's pretty cool. And the fact that I can do this inbuilt on an iPad, it's amazing. So that is half of the mix done. So the bass amp, what have I done here? So the bass, and in fact the entire bass, is only processed on its master bus. What have I done? I've added some low end. I've used the overall bus compressor just to hold down a couple of dB on this, because the bass was fairly quite round and saturated anyway, going through a Sans amp and an Ampeg amp as well. So it just needed its attacky transients just holding back a little, and just, yeah, a bit more low end bloom. And that's it. Rhythm guitars, similar kind of treatment. There's nothing on the individual tracks, they've just been sent here. So all I've done to them is lifted the high end a little, added a little kind of 300, 400 hertz, or maybe even 200 hertz warmth into the guitars because they were sounding a little thin. And the bus compressor just, again, holds the attacky transients in place, because without, that's very attacky, very transienty. On its own it sounds nice, but in the mix suddenly it's going king, 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 king. So by bus compressing just a twitch, that just holds those nasty notes in. One thing that's interesting here is that this is being sent a lot to aux 1. Now aux 1 is something I haven't talked about yet, that this has 6 inbuilt aux sends and returns with effects just inbuilt. So thinking about it like an analog desk, my aux 1 is a reverb. And if I just listen to, let's just solo the aux return here so we can, come on. It's so it's a kind of lexicon style digital reverb, but it seems to fit here. So I've got a couple of seconds of roll off time. The ultra high end's been taken out to stop it sounding like an 80s track. And that's it. And just sending some of the vocals, some of the bass, some of the snare, not the bass, some of the vocal, the rhythm guitars, the snare to this has just given it some space and a bit of glue in the mix, because glue is what this is all really about. The vocal is pretty heavily compressed with a very fast attack and release that you can see here. They're absolutely pinned, because that's how you do something like an 1176 compressor, is absolutely nailed. So this is 4:1. This is my virtual 1176. It's not quite as good as the real deal, but then what is, let's be honest. Let's go back. So, the singer Neil is singing through a gate just to stop the headphones from bleeding over. I mean, it's very, very light, this. It's minus 50 or something on the expander, so this is literally just to stop him sniffing and sneezing through the mix. There's no EQ on this. Let's have a look. So on the, yeah, there's no EQ at all on the entire vocal channel throughout this entire thing. It's just the SE Gemini 2 is mix ready. It just needs quite heavy compression because it's a rock track, but otherwise, it's done. If I just go back and... On the sound.
And I'm losing.
And also I've managed to kind of EQ the mix around Neil's vocal. So between that vocal and the rhythm guitars, there's a certain airiness and projection to the vocal. I've not added that. That's just there on that microphone. What have we done to the guitar solos? So they're being sent to the solo bus with a delay on it. So the So there's a little bit of a delay on the guitars just to give them a bit of space. And the backing vocals, let's have a look at them. So they don't have any effects on at all, they're just caked in reverb. And the gang vocal, it looks like I've done the same. So they just sit together underneath the main vocal. So they're meant to be quite rough and like another brick in the wall or that kind of thing. So they got plenty of reverb on, but they don't really need anything else because the main vocal carries it. The main vocal sits above and does this. Because the main vocals in mono are dead center. So the whole mix is pretty much there. Right. The last thing to mention is that there's even a master track set of a master channel strip. So I've just added a little bit of low end push, a little bit of kind of 500 hertz overall times 10, so 5K. I've just pushed the high mids on the mix because it was sounding a little bit woolly overall when I listened back to it on other speakers. There's a bus compressor just holding things together at 1.5 to 1 ratio, which is next to nothing. And what else we got? That's it. So the entire song, that's a mix right there. So let's make sure, yep, everything start to end is timed right. So if I just go to menu mix down, entire song, 24-bit stereo, export to my Dropbox, and then hit OK, that's going to make me a mix down. And then we will look at mastering, still on the iPad, using Final Touch, which is by the same guys that make Bias, Positive Grid. And then that'll be an entire mix and a master using nothing but an iPad. How's about that? So if you've already got one of these, your mum and dad have already got one of these that you can borrow, or you can just make use of one if you don't have a powerful computer to do everything on, or you want to record on location, or you want to mix while you're out and about. This is a genuinely professional way to do it that pretty much covers all the bases. One last thing to mention is, well, I already mentioned it, the plugin store. There is things like PSP's Vintage Warmer. There are Fab Filters plugins in there, so if you know of a plugin that you like, you can probably buy it in the plugin store for Auria for not that much money, because iPad products tend to go for less than desktop products for whatever crazy reason. And you can get the sound that you know and the sound that you're looking for. We'll cover the mastering in another video. I'm Adam Steele for The Hot Pole. Thanks for watching. Like if you liked it, leave a comment below. Dislike it, don't dislike it please. And subscribe and tell your friends. If there's anything else that you want me to cover, anything specific, then let me know and I'll see if I can do a video on it. Thanks for watching.